The American trains are way prettier though. I don't know why initially Americans made the tunnels bigger, but that might have been like one of the best choices ever. What's up guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here then welcome to our little corner of the internet. Today we're going to be watching a video titled Why Europe's Freight Trains Are So Short and America's Are 3 miles long, which I can't even begin to imagine a 3-mile long train. I've never seen a freight train in Europe either, but a 3-mile long train, that's like nearly 5 kilometers. It's wild. But without further ado, let's see what this video is about.
If you stand at a railroad crossing somewhere in rural Kansas and wait for a Union Pacific freight train to pass, you might be standing there for a while. The locomotives come first, 3 or 4 diesel units pulling in formation, and behind them stretches a chain of double-stacked container cars that disappears into the horizon. 2 miles of train, sometimes closer to 3 miles. The crossing gates stay down, the warning lights keep flashing, and the cars keep rolling past, one after another, for 10 minutes or more.
What happened there? They was about to have a Caesar.
One after another, for 10 minutes or more.
Okay.
Now picture a freight train in Germany. A single electric locomotive pulling a line of container wagons, each one loaded with a single layer of boxes. The entire train fits inside 740 meters, about half a mile. It passes a grade crossing in under a minute. Same century, same cargo, same global economy. But the trains look like they belong to 2 different eras of railroading. So what happened? How did 2 wealthy, industrialized parts of the world end up with freight trains that are not even in the same category of size? The answer is not one decision. It is a chain of decisions, stretching back over 150 years, involving wars, politics, tunnel dimensions, and a single piece of American legislation that most railroad historians consider the dividing line between 2 eras. Nobody was paying attention to loading gauges and passing siding lengths when these choices were being made. They were arguing about ticket prices, about Cold War priorities, about whether governments or private companies should control the tracks. But every argument left behind infrastructure, and infrastructure is the one thing you cannot easily take back. The place to start is underground, specifically inside the tunnels and beneath the bridges that define what a railroad can carry. Every rail network has something called a loading gauge, the maximum height and width that a rail car can be and still fit through the tightest.
I was about to say that, like, obviously if there's 2 different types of trains, like, time will tell which one is better, and then I was like, why wouldn't the other countries like follow that? But it's true, when there's so much infrastructure that goes into it, and you can't change all of that, so you can't really change the trains, I guess, anymore. So they're probably just going to be evolving completely separate to each other, which is kind of weird, but makes sense at the same time.
Maximum height and width that a rail car can be and still fit through the tightest spot on the line. In America, newly built freight cars now reach up to 23 feet from the rail. In Europe, that number sits at 15 to 16 feet. The gap sounds modest on paper, maybe 30%. In practice, it changes everything. At 23 feet,
Wow,
American
but that's so
railroads
pretty.
can stack 2 shipping containers on top of each other using specially designed well cars that cradle the lower container down between the wheel trucks. This is called double stacking, and it is one of the most consequential innovations in modern freight transportation.
The American trains are way prettier though, 100%.
The lower container sits nested inside the car frame, reducing the overall height and lowering the center of gravity. The upper container rides on top. 1 rail car, 2 layers of cargo. At 15 to 16 feet, European railroads simply cannot do this. The tunnels bored through the Alps and the Pyrenees in the 19th century were cut to dimensions that accommodated the passenger coaches, and single-layer freight wagons of their era. And widening a mountain tunnel is one of the most expensive civil engineering projects imaginable. The bridges are not any more forgiving, and the overhead catenary wires that power Europe's electric locomotives eat into the remaining vertical space even further. Double stacking on standard European rail infrastructure is not a regulatory choice or a budget decision.
Damn, everything really is bigger in America, first of all. And second of all, well, I don't know if that's only the saying in Texas. And second of all, that I don't know why initially Americans made the tunnels bigger, but that might have been like one of the best choices ever, because that's like double the efficiency, you know, like it makes the trains be able to export so much more than in Europe. It's just way more convenient. But okay, Europe, okay.
It is a physical impossibility dictated by stone, concrete, and steel that has been in place for over a century. The double stack story begins in 1976, when engineers at Southern Pacific Railroad and the shipping company Sealand sat down with ACF Industries to design a new kind of rail car. By 1977, they had a working prototype. It was a well car that could carry one container nested low in the frame and a second stacked on top. The idea was elegant, but adoption was painfully slow. Railroads were skeptical of the investment required, and the infrastructure was not ready to handle the taller loads without clearance work that nobody wanted to pay for. The economics had not yet proven themselves at scale, and the shipping industry was still adapting to containerization itself. That changed in 1984. American President Lines partnered with Union Pacific to launch the first all-double-stack train service.
These are so pretty. The trains are so pretty. Like, I cannot. This reminds me of the movie of the Christmas train, or what is the movie called? Where the characters like super creepy, but it's like a Christmas movie about this boy who like goes on a train and then they go to a Christmas city, and you know what I'm talking about? Well, that's what these trains remind me of.
Lines partnered with Union Pacific to launch the first all-double-stack train service, and that train left Los Angeles loaded with containers stacked too high, bound for South Kearny, New Jersey, transferring between railroads along the way. They called it Stack Train. What it proved would reshape the economics of freight railroading for decades. Double stacking cut container shipping costs by 35 to 45% per mile. With savings like that, the investment to raise tunnels and clear bridges paid for itself fast. Southern Pacific spent roughly $490 million enlarging 32 tunnels and raising 58 bridges along its Sunset route between Los Angeles and New Orleans. The project took 8 years. It returned its capital cost within 7. This is where the American and European freight rail stories begin to diverge in earnest, because in the same decade that America was redesigning its rail corridors to carry taller, heavier, longer trains, Europe was pouring its investment into something else entirely: passengers. The fork in the road traces back to the years after World War II. Both continents faced the same fundamental question: what is a railroad for, and who should it serve? America answered with highways. The interstate highway system, authorized in 1956, gave passengers and light freight a vast new network of roads stretching coast to coast. That left the railroads increasingly focused on what they did best: moving heavy goods over enormous distances with unmatched fuel efficiency. Europe answered differently. Governments there saw rail as a public service, a way to connect dense cities and move people between them at speed. Investment went toward electrification, toward faster schedules, toward new rolling stock, and eventually toward high-speed rail. France launched the TGV in 1981. Germany built the ICE network during the 1990s. Tracks that might have carried freight were upgraded for passenger traffic instead, and the priorities of the entire network shifted accordingly.
Oof. I don't know how I feel about high-speed rail. Have you guys ever been in a high-speed rail train? I think I've been to some, but like not like the most, like the fastest. But it's kind of the same feeling as when you're flying, like, well, I don't know if you guys have this or if you're afraid to fly. I'm not really afraid to fly, but there's always that little lingering thought of something could go really wrong. Well, I get the same thing when I go on this high-speed train because it's just, I don't know. It just goes so fast that it feels almost like unnatural, you know? I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it.
This decision wasn't irrational. Europe's geography favored it. Dense clusters of cities separated by short distances made high-speed passenger rail practical and popular in a way it never quite became in America. But every euro spent on passenger infrastructure was a euro not spent on freight capacity. And over decades, those compounding choices built two completely different railroad civilizations on opposite sides of the Atlantic. By the 1970s, American railroads were in serious trouble, not because of the highways alone, but because of regulation that had calcified over nearly a century. The Interstate Commerce Commission controlled nearly every aspect of freight pricing, and the rules hadn't kept pace with economic reality. Railroads couldn't...
Oh my god, this is so pretty. It's so pretty. Imagine turning that into like a, I don't know, like an Airbnb. I mean, you could, maybe. Wouldn't that would be cool? Like like every single like the thing, every single of those where the conductor goes would be like a bedroom with like pretty lights and everything, and then there would be like okay, that would be cool. That's what I would do with this.
And the rules hadn't kept pace with economic reality. Railroads couldn't set competitive rates to win back customers from trucking companies. They couldn't abandon money-losing branch lines that drained capital from the rest of the network. They were bleeding cash while their tracks deteriorated underneath them. Penn Central, the largest railroad in the country, and the product of a desperate merger between two struggling northeastern giants, collapsed into bankruptcy in 1970. It was the biggest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. The Rock Island Line followed. So did the Milwaukee Road. In the Northeast, the situation grew so dire that the federal government had to step in and create Conrail, a government-backed corporation just to keep freight moving through the industrial heartland. Industry observers warned openly that if the broader system couldn't be stabilized, full nationalization of American freight rail was a real possibility. The legislation that changed everything arrived on October 14th, 1980. When President Jimmy Carter sat down at the White House and signed the Staggers Rail Act into law. It gave railroads the freedom to set their own rates, negotiate contracts with individual shippers, and shed unprofitable routes. The stakes were clear, because if deregulation failed, nationalization was the only alternative left on the table. It didn't fail, and the transformation that swept across American rail yards and main lines over the next 4 decades surprised even the optimists. So what does a deregulated freight railroad do when it finally controls its own destiny? In the decades after the Staggers Act, American freight railroads reinvested approximately $840 billion back into their own infrastructure. They lengthened sidings to accommodate longer trains. They upgraded track to handle heavier axle loads. And they cleared tunnels and bridges for double-stack service across thousands.
That double stack thing looks wild. That looks so scary. Or like, not scary, but you know, like that looks like it's gonna fall at any point. Obviously it's not, but still, that looks crazy. Looks kind of like one of them shipping boats.
And they cleared tunnels and bridges for double-stack service across thousands of miles of mainline track. Inflation-adjusted shipping rates dropped 44% between 1981 and 2024. A single crew operating a single train could now move the equivalent of hundreds of truckloads of cargo in one run. The system became, by many measures, the most efficient freight rail network on the planet. Europe didn't get a Staggers Act. What Europe got instead was a slow and difficult process of trying to reform state-owned railroads that had been built as national institutions, each one designed to serve its own country with its own engineering standards and operating rules. And this is where the fragmentation across European rail networks enters the picture. Consider what happens when a freight train tries to cross from France into Germany. It doesn't just cross a political border, it crosses into a different signaling universe.
Oh,
Europe has more than 20 incompatible national signaling and speed control systems scattered across the continent.
true. Because Europe is not one country, it's different countries. So everyone has different things going on. I would hate to be a train conductor in Europe, like crossing the country and suddenly being like in a completely another place with different like lights and signs.
A locomotive certified to run in France cannot read the signals in Germany without additional onboard equipment. 5 different coupling mechanisms exist across European countries. Electrification voltages vary from one national network to the next. The Thalys high-speed train, which connects Paris, Brussels, Cologne, and Amsterdam, carries at least 7 different signaling systems on board just to navigate 4 countries. For freight operators, every border crossing adds cost, complexity, and delay. Locomotives need certification for each country they enter. Crews need training on each national system. And the European Union has been trying to fix this since the late 1980s with something called the European Rail Traffic Management System. The goal is to replace all 20-plus national systems with one unified standard, a digital backbone that would let any locomotive cross any border without swapping equipment or stopping for crew changes. On paper, it's the obvious solution. In practice, implementation has been anything but smooth. As of 2025, deployment remains slow, uneven, and fragmented across member states. Different countries are implementing different versions on different timelines. If you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. This channel covers the history and engineering behind the world's railroads, with new documentaries every week.
And this channel covers stuff I react to with new videos every day.
The European Court of Auditors concluded that deployment was low and limited. Industry groups have warned that, without acceleration, the promise of an interoperable European railway remains, in their words, a pipe dream. But signaling is only one layer of the problem. European passing sidings and rail yards were built to accommodate short trains, because short trains were all the network ever needed to handle. In Italy, permitted train lengths vary from 480 meters to 625 meters, depending on the route. In Germany, the standard is 740 meters, with special corridor approvals sometimes allowing 835 meters. France permits 850-meter trains on select corridors between Perpignan and Luxembourg, but the overall European target remains 740 meters, roughly 2,400 feet, half a mile. Compare that to what American Class 1 railroads run through the Southwest on a routine basis. In December of 2024, monitoring data showed that Union Pacific operated 3 to 4 trains per day, longer than 2.5 miles between California and Texas. BNSF ran a similar volume at similar lengths. These are not special record-breaking attempts. They are scheduled revenue trains.
That looks so cool. I've never seen this. I've only seen this in the movie Garfield, the movie, where Garfield goes and like changes the trains or something. But it looks like the same in real life, and I didn't expect that. And it's really cool. I like it.
These are not special record-breaking attempts. They are scheduled revenue trains, hauling containers and bulk goods across the network every single day of the year. Why does length matter so much? Because the economics of freight railroading are driven by fixed costs that do not change whether a train is half a mile long or 3 miles long. One crew operates the locomotives regardless of how many cars trail behind them. One-time slot on the dispatching schedule gets consumed whether the train carries 50 containers or 300. The fuel cost per ton-mile drops as the train gets longer because the locomotives are already burning diesel to move their own weight. Every additional car added to the consist spreads those fixed costs across more cargo. For a privately owned railroad trying to maximize return on investment, the incentive to run longer trains is relentless. In Europe, the incentive structure is fundamentally different. Infrastructure managers are publicly funded national institutions whose primary obligation is keeping passenger trains running on time. Freight gets the leftover capacity, squeezed into gaps between commuter services and intercity expresses. There is not an equivalent profit-driven pressure to push train lengths to their physical limits, because the infrastructure managers do not earn revenue from freight the way American railroads earn revenue from every ton-mile they carry. The productivity gap this creates is staggering. To move the same tonnage of freight, Europe requires roughly 7 times more trains than the United States.
But what does Europe use for like shipping and stuff like that then? Because trains obviously I'm guessing they use them as well, but there must be something like to compensate.
European operational revenues per ton mile run about double the American figure, which means European freight rail is spending more to move less. Freight rail's share of the European transportation market tells perhaps the stark
what?
American figure, which means European freight rail is spending more to move less.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Freight rail's share of the European transportation market tells perhaps the starkest story of all. In the 1950s, railroads carried around 60% of European freight by ton kilometers. That share dropped to 30% by the 1980s. Today it sits at roughly 15%. In America, freight rail still carries somewhere between 28 and 40% of all goods measured by ton miles. The American system isn't without its own problems, though. The push toward ever longer trains has created genuine safety concerns that communities along rail corridors know well. Trains exceeding 2 miles take 1 to 1.5 miles to stop at speed. Grade crossings can remain blocked for 30 minutes or longer when a massive freight consist passes through town. The Government Accountability Office has documented thousands of crossing blockage incidents in states like Texas alone. Communities near rail lines find themselves effectively cut in half, and regulatory debates now center on whether the federal government should impose length caps, with proposals hovering around 7,500 feet, roughly 1.5 miles. Europe, for its part, is trying to change its trajectory. The European Union set a target of shifting 30% of road freight traveling more than 300 kilometers onto rail by 2030. A McKinsey analysis found that achieving this goal would require France and Germany to shift 90% of goods traveling more than 500 kilometers onto rail. That is an enormous transformation, and it faces the very infrastructure constraints that have limited European freight trains for generations. Tunnels have not grown taller since the 19th century. Passing sidings remain stubbornly short, and signaling systems, despite decades of effort and billions in spending, still are not unified across the continent. Neither system represents a failure of intelligence or engineering ambition. They represent different answers to an identical set of pressures, shaped by geography, politics, population density, and a century of accumulated infrastructure decisions that are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. America had vast distances between cities, abundant land for rail corridors, and an industry structure where private railroads could profit directly by carrying more freight in bigger trains. Europe had dense urban networks, shorter distances between economic centers, and a political tradition that treated rail as a public passenger service first and a freight carrier second. A 3-mile-long American freight train rolling through the Texas desert isn't a boast. A 740-meter European freight train
That's so pretty. Is that in
Texas
Europe?
desert isn't a boast.
Where is this? I'm gonna move here. Look at how pretty. I love it. That would be the dream.
740-meter European freight train threading through the Alps isn't an embarrassment.
Oh, in the Alps.
They are both the logical products of the systems that built them. Systems that began diverging before anyone alive today was born, shaped by choices that seemed reasonable at the time, and that compounded into infrastructure realities that are staggeringly hard to undo. The question that neither continent has fully answered yet is what comes next, and whether the railroads they inherited can be reshaped fast enough to meet the demands of a world that needs to move more freight with fewer emissions and less highway congestion than ever before.
That was a great video. This video reminds me of like sometimes I look at the title of the video and I'm like, will I be interested in that? And then I watch it and I'm like fascinated by it. And this was one of those types of videos. Like it makes the kind of like no sense at the start why they would be different, and then you realize that it makes all the sense in the world, and it's quite fascinating how they like have grown so separately. I don't know. I really enjoyed that video. That was very well made as well. Thank you guys for joining me for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video.